afternoon, evening. You guys are coming from different places, so really glad to have you here. Welcome to the Epistemic Decolonization Seminar Series. We are today starting with Sundar Sarukkai. Sundar Sarukkai works primarily in philosophy of natural and social sciences. He's the founder of Barefoot Philosophers. I'll share the link to that in the chat soon. And he's currently a visiting faculty at the Center for Society and Policy, Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. He's author of Translating the World, Science and Language, Philosophy of Symmetry, Indian Philosophy and Philosophy of Science, What is Science? He's also co-authored 2 books with Gopal Guru on the cracked mirror and Indian debate on experience and theory, and more recently, Experience, Caste and Everyday Social. His latest book is Philosophy for Children, which has been published in English, Hindi, Tamil, Kannada, Malayalam, and Bengali. He's also a series editor. I always screw that up. He's a series editor for Science and Technology Studies series, Routledge, and the co-chief editor of Springer Handbook of Logical Thought in India. Welcome, Sundar. Really glad to have you here. I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to, before that, just one quick thing. I'm going to request everyone to please mute your microphones. You can, of course, raise your hand or put your questions in the chat, and Sundar can take it at his convenience. Thank you. Over to you, Sundar.
Thank you, Sahana, and your colleagues for this invite to talk in this particular series. A very important one, and I'm very glad to have the opportunity to share some thoughts on this. I was also particularly struck by the fact that after your earlier series on larger questions of epistemic decolonization, the kinds of questions you had asked for this series of talks were more about the practical implementation and the various kinds of issues involved in talking about this idea of decolonization of philosophy of science. So I thought what was most apt in this context is actually to begin with an example of a text which I wrote, a book which you mentioned, the text called Indian Philosophy and Philosophy of Science. I'll start with that and try and explain how that was associated with some questions of decolonization of philosophy of science, and what really did it achieve and what it meant to try and build upon this particular project. By doing this, it's not an introduction to this book. I'm saying this more because I want to try and use the challenges which the book had, which I faced in talking about the book, in order to position the problems of decolonizing philosophy of science. So I think the whole dynamics of the decolonizing philosophy of science was actually captured in my experience with this particular book. So I'm going to start with just as an example of how I entered into this and what it really meant in the larger context of philosophy of science. So let me start directly with this particular observation that when I came to National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, it was an institute started by J.R.D. Tata. And the first director was Dr. Raja Ramanna, who many of us would know, particularly from India. He was a physicist, a nuclear physicist, was also seen as the father of the Indian nuclear program. And, we wanted to start something in philosophy of science. So it was already a very difficult time to try and imagine what it is to do philosophy of science in a place like India. So for me, when I entered into this particular place, I had very little awareness of the questions of decolonization. So this was in the early 90s. I joined NIAS in 1994. And my engagement with decolonization came slowly. And there is a big social process in which the questions of decolonization entered into our imagination. For me, I still remember it was first catalyzed by when I stumbled upon Claude Alvarez's wonderful book called Decolonizing History, which is largely about the questions of science and technology in ancient and medieval India. And then through Alvarez's work, I encountered the amazingly rich work by Dharampal on the history of science and technology and others. It was also during this time, during the time of my learning about these questions of what constituted science and technology in other cultures, having come from a completely, an education in science and also my education in philosophy, which is largely based on Western traditions. So it was also a great opening to encounter Michael Addas's book, Machines as the Measure of Man, which to me was an excellent eye-opener, which does a comparative analysis of technology in India, China, and Africa. Now, I read all of this and I was beginning to be as information, and since given my larger interest in science per se, but I did not see this as having a direct relation to my work in philosophy of science. And in the meantime, as part of my professional work and also as part of my interest, I wrote 2 books, the first 2 books which Sahana mentioned. The first one called Translating the World, Science and Language, which was basically, and then the second one called Philosophy of Symmetry. So the first book drew extensively on theories of meaning, translation studies, philosophy of language, discourse, analysis, etc., but all of it drawn only from Western philosophical traditions. The second book, which analyzed the concept of symmetry as it is used in the sciences and arts, led me to using analytical philosophy and phenomenology in my attempt to understand the foundation of the concept of symmetry. I'm saying this not to give a list of what I have written, but just to tell you, to give you the logic of how I entered into this question of Indian philosophy and philosophy of science. Because I start with these observations because by then, in a sense, I had paid my due in some sense of having written these 2 books, which dealt with more standard philosophy of science, as it were. And I think that also allowed me to be ready to listen to the demands of decolonization, because it was also during this period that I learned much about Indian logic, particularly from phenomenally important work of B.K. Matilal and J. Mohanty. And what these books did, and the books surrounding these texts did, was it opened my eyes to extremely rich work in logic in various Indian traditions. Now, what surprised me was the recognition that so many fundamental concepts, such as causality, very basic, simple concepts, which are bread and butter of philosophy of science, causality, time, space, motion, inference, both deductive and inductive inferences, nature of perception, observation, the link between observations to generalizations, etc. All of these topics were developed at length in many of these philosophical schools. And what surprised me more was that texts in philosophy dealing with these topics, in philosophy of science, seemed to be completely unaware of this rich body of work. And I'm just restricting myself to this particular tradition which I encountered. So it's a very historical story I'm telling you. And as we go along, we realize that there is a large amount of work from different cultural traditions on, as I said, on conceptual terms like space, time, causality, motion, and so on. But even then, I was not working from the consciousness of a particular consciousness of decolonization. It is only when I started looking at the many philosophy of science books in order to see what kind of a book I wanted to write in philosophy of science that I realized that this absence of other philosophical traditions was, to put it perhaps dramatically, was actually an intellectual crime. And that there was little that was innocent about this complete erasure of the availability of material, not about the acceptance of those texts or immediately saying that this is very important. That's secondary, that's unimportant. To me, working from within a paradigm of science, which is interested in looking at new ideas and engaging with those ideas and testing the boundaries and the strength of those ideas, it seemed to be that the whole philosophical community and of course the philosophy of science community as a subset were completely not just ignorant about it, indifferent to the availability of this material and to think about how to draw upon them. Not to draw upon them for political correctness or because somebody else from China, Africa, and India have written, but to draw upon them to see whether it can offer new perspectives to the philosophy of science, to an understanding of the foundations of science. So when, therefore, I resolved to write a book on philosophy of science, using Indian philosophy as a framework to counter this excessive indifference in philosophy of science to other philosophical traditions. And I wanted to do a book which was not going to merely claim, like there are already some popular books saying, Indian philosophy was a relation to quantum theory and relativity and so on. But I wanted to do something very different. I wanted to do a book which was not going to claim that other philosophies are important, but I wanted to show with examples of how that is possible and why it is desirable. So to me, without the consciousness of what I would call today as decolonizing philosophy of science, to me, from a completely different perspective, from a very pedagogical perspective, I thought I want to show how can we look at these very simple examples rather than make these broad claims that, Indian philosophy does this, Indian philosophy does that. And we should remember that no intellectual tradition develops, no notion of knowledge develops without particular social and material conditions. And in India, in the 90s and afterwards, there's a major shift in the politics of the country. And therefore, doing these kinds of work, drawing upon Indian philosophy, etc., was fraught with various political problems. And one had to confront that as well as I was trying to understand how to make sense of philosophy of science today. And I just want to give you a very brief illustration of how I dealt with this, because based on that, I will then try and position why philosophy of science continues this complete indifference towards other philosophical traditions. So the first, of course, for most of us coming from philosophy of science, that the standard books in philosophy of science will have beginning with questions of relationship between science and logic, the nature of observations, the link between theory, experiment link, etc., etc. It then might want to give a philosophical language to it when it talks about it in terms of epistemology of science, ontology of science, and so on. And typically in many of these standard books, they will begin with Aristotle, Plato, and go through the usual suspects. Some of the essential questions, including, for example, the question of causality, notions of substance, and so on, will begin with Aristotle, and we know the impact of Platonism on questions of mathematics, and so on. And even the question on logic, where texts begin with questions of logic, it will begin with the deductive and inductive logic, Aristotelian syllogisms, and so on. And that's, I think, very important contribution to our understanding of the structures of science. And obviously, for students of philosophy of science, we learn a lot from this extensive drawing upon Western philosophical tradition to understand the nature of science. But what I didn't understand was whether, independent of what science was, if the task of philosophy of science was to use philosophical ideas, philosophical traditions, philosophical concepts, and argumentations within these philosophical traditions to throw light on the processes of science, to throw light on the structure of science, then I didn't understand why this extensive work on these themes in other cultural philosophical traditions were not part of this engagement within philosophy of science. So in the book, I began with a very simple question. What is this holy link between Greek, Western science, and philosophy? And there seemed to be a paradoxical question for me here, because given the history of the rejection, particularly first of scholasticism, which is a very important moment in the creation of Western science, and the rejection of
Okay, I'm not sure if it's just me. I think I lost Sundar.
Yeah, he got a problem with the mic or something.
Sundar. Hi, Sundar.
it has to do with, yeah?
Yeah, we lost you in between. So you're going to have to start 30 to 40 seconds. Again, repeat.
Oh, I'm really sorry.
No problem.
Okay.
We can hear you now.
Yeah, okay, great. So please stop me when you hear me. So I was just trying to say that, the question about the holy link between Greek, Western science, and philosophy, given their history, and if there was a disjunction between certain aspects of Greek thought, including scholasticism and certain core Aristotelian ideas, which had to be overthrown in order for modern science to be possible, then the question was very simple. Why is it that philosophy of science ran back to these same traditions from which science had to break away from? So what I tried to do in the book was essentially to engage with this and to show what would, drawing upon other philosophical traditions, what might it entail, what might it imply for the development of philosophy of science, without ever claiming that this is a radical difference and therefore philosophy of science will be very different, etc. I'm not interested in that particular kind of an argument. I just wanted to see how might it look different, what could be learned, even if it is a very little bit. And so when I began from this book, I'll just read parts of the excerpts of the book to make it very brief so that I don't go on about it. So I begin by pointing out there's a strong belief that Greek thought is intrinsically related to science, and that therefore, a position that betrays an unreasonable dependence on Greek philosophy in philosophy of science. So I begin by looking at Gadamer in his book, The Beginning of Knowledge, a collection of lectures, where he repeats many of the things which many others have done. So I'm just using this as an example, where after he notes that Greek philosophy included scientific thought, he continues to make the same mistakes as many others before him when he writes, quote, "What separates the Occident, Europe, the so-called Western world, from the great hierarchic cultures of Asian countries is precisely this awakening of the desire to know, with which Greek philosophy, Greek mathematics, Greek medicine, and the whole of the theoretical curiosity and their intellectual mastery is associated." And for him, the question was, like for many people, that there was something essential between what the Greeks were doing through their philosophy and science, which was not available to anybody else. And therefore, it is very natural that philosophy of science has to work within that particular kind of a framework. This is what I would call as the originary issue for philosophy of science. And this particular point of view is further strengthened by the common observation that natural science grew out of philosophy. Now, by doing it this way, it ignores the point about why science broke away from traditional philosophy. And therefore, it leads to the potential paradox of philosophy of science. It insists on using philosophical insights from traditions whose rejection in the first place catalyzed modern science. So what I tried to do was to show the claim, to establish the validity of my claim, that certain aspects of Indian philosophy are not only relevant to a foundationalist description of science, but that they also share something in common with scientific methodology. So what I do is, for example, the first chapter, after the introduction, I begin with the topic of doubt. And we know, for example, and I must say I'm very clear about who my target audience was. I'm talking about questions of students in India, for example, and of course, I would think Asia and Africa, for all that they hear about when they read about questions of doubt or about causality is Descartes for doubt and Hume for causality, for example. Very dominant understanding, usage of these kinds of structures. So for me, the point was to try and show what are the other ways in which people have thought about doubt. So like Descartes, Indian philosophical systems also begin with prioritizing the nature of doubt. For the Indian logicians, particularly the Nyaya school. So for me, a lot of my drawing upon the logic in this context were primarily from the Buddhist and the Nyaya school. For the Nyaya school, doubt is the beginning of inquiry. And the process of inquiry is always to resolve a doubt and reach a state of certainty. And the Nyaya formulation of doubt is very interesting. It's very rich and complex in many ways. Doubts are framed in an interrogative form, which in modern terms can seem to be belonging to what are called the alternate type of questions. Doubts are classified into different kinds. Doubts and its resolution are an integral part of the rich tradition of debate in Indian philosophy. And the whole idea of what it is to do philosophy in this particular process is to begin with questions of doubt and an eradication of doubt. As part of debate, it embodies a rational strategy. And the strategy in the Nyaya, for example, is a 16-step process, which includes the question of empirical observation. And then there are some fundamental principles and the use of what is called a 5-step syllogisms, like the Aristotelian 2-step syllogisms. And then the Indian theories of doubt range from the skeptical mode in Buddhist schools to a pragmatic approach by philosophies such as Nyaya. And one of the things which I was trying to point out to make this common connection was actually by the close relationship between a philosopher like Charles Sanders Peirce, the American pragmatist, with Nyaya's position on various aspects. And somewhere in the book, I even mentioned that Peirce should be called a follower of the Nyaya tradition because there is so much affinity between so many of his ideas, particularly the questions of skeptical doubt, and later on about the questions of logic as semiotics. And so what I basically did was to try and begin with this argument with doubt, and then because there is so much of attempt to try and make this a philosophy of science book which people can actually make use of without saying, I don't get it, these are all very complicated, we don't know what kinds of terminologies they're used. So I gave an introduction in the 3rd chapter to essential ideas of Indian logic, just a basic summary of many of the ideas about what is Indian logic. And basically the logical tradition in India was very simple. Its logic was about the nature of reasoning, argumentation, and the art of persuasion, and they were described under the term inference. And the questions which they dealt with were very simple. How do we infer? What do we infer? How can we distinguish between a valid and invalid inference? And this long historical traditions, which begins with Nyaya, goes into the Buddhists, and two of the greatest philosophers. There is, of course, Nagarjuna to me is one of the greatest philosophers whose text, which I would think every philosophy student should read. But in this book, I was looking at two Buddhist logicians, Dignaga and Dharmakirti, were very innovative descriptions of inference through the idea of a sign. And that led me to look at the relationship between logic and semiotics, because to me, the idea of, for example, just to give you a very quick clarification, the idea of when I see smoke, I infer fire. And the question of logical analysis was to ask, why when I see smoke, I infer fire? What is the structure of that inference? And so the very interesting way in which the Buddhist logic does this is by how I interpret it as like it would do in terms of interpreting sign and signified, and therefore it brings the larger semiotics understanding within the study of logic. And I'm sure that many of you who are aware of this will immediately see its connection to the work by Peirce on logic and semiotics and so on. So what I did was to try and show, look, if you want to look at just these concepts, okay, forget about whether they're West and East and North and South. If you're looking at concepts such as deduction, induction, nature of necessary relations, law-like structures, reductio reasoning, the role of fallacies, and the meaning of definitions, and the nature of properties, which are very deeply connected to metaphysics, then, there are all these ideas which are there. And I want to list them out, and so that any reader can then say, well, I like this and I don't feel comfortable with this particular point of view. So let me see how I can work with these kinds, for example, the different set of fallacies which may be present in different logical traditions. So what I do in the remaining part of the book is to use this to show specific connections between Indian philosophy and philosophy of science. And therefore, I introduce a simple introduction to the core topics in philosophy of science in chapter 4, talking primarily about logic and science, etc. And then I make this major difference in an argument about the difference between this kind of an approach from Indian philosophy to philosophy of science, and very loosely what you could call as Western philosophy's approach to philosophy of science. So I captured the difference by using the phrases, quote, logic in science as against science in logic. And what I show in that text is to say that there are two particular questions of, about the relationship between logic and science. Now, you could look for science as we see today and ask, where is logic present in science? In contrast, Indian logicians, I argue in the book, were demanding that logic itself be quote unquote scientific. And again, there are questions on what is science, etc. I'll clarify it if there's any discussions on this. But at the structurally, what seems to be the difference is that it is a question of priority, whether logic comes first or science, that is at the heart of the difference between Indian and Western logic, that is characterized by the question, should logic be scientific or should science be logical? Okay. Now, this question might make sense, of course, if we clarify the meanings of logic and science. If by scientific we mean both an empirical and theoretical mode of reflection, then logic is not scientific for Western logic, since the essential character of logic is outside the domains of the empirical in an explicit manner. We know the formulations of formal logic, then mathematical logic, and so on. Anyway, so this is a very important way by which I was able to not just look at the similarities of different philosophical traditions, but also at differences in order to explore what it would imply for conceptual ideas like necessity, the modality terms like necessity and possible, questions of nature of laws, and so on. And the point about semiotics, logic as semiotics and its connection to science is also something which is very important for contemporary science. Because the semiotic character of science, by the way, is not often discussed. But we know this very well, that there is much in science that is played out through the language of semiotics. For example, we need look no further than interpretation of experimental observations. Because when you see an experimental, especially in instrumental perception, that dictates the logic of observations, experiments in science, from an experimental observation, how can we be sure that what you observe as a data, for example, the picture of an electron as a photograph, a line in a photograph, how can you be sure that that line corresponds to really the existence of an electron? And this can be analyzed as a sign referring to a signified, and that and you know all the things which surround that, which I'm sure many of you who know this field know this well. If you look at Buddhist logicians like Dignaga, when he gives 3 conditions for a sign to be a logical sign, and if you extend this question into the semiotics of experimental observation, you will see there are a lot of very interesting things one can actually say about these things. And finally, I conclude this whole analysis by looking at the notions of Indian syllogisms for the Indian logical syllogisms and its relationship to the structure of the deductive nomological model of scientific explanation. Okay, and finally, the last 2 chapters, I'm not going to talk about it. One deals with the question of knowledge, a particular response to many Western scholars who questioned the idea that there was something called knowledge and that there is something called theory within Indian and Chinese, the Asian traditions. And finally, I end with questions of language. Now, this very briefly and very quickly was to give you an idea of what I was trying to do in trying to, when I was using the term Indian philosophy and philosophy of science, not as a decolonial project or not as a decolonization project, but merely as a project to ask how are multiple foundations which are possible, which might make me understand the foundations of science better. Now, it so happened the book got good reviews in different journals, including Philosophy East West and so on. But in my view, I think it made little dent. Not the book, I'm least interested in the book. The book was part of a much larger project, which was the brainchild of a philosopher who was at Jadavpur, Professor D.P. Chattopadhyay. And he got a project called PHISPC, and part of it was to produce texts which are, academically, scholarly, rigorous work on different, traditions within history, social sciences, the sciences, and so on from the Indian tradition, at least to give it as a kind of an encyclopedic availability, to make things available for people who might be interested to want to read it. So most of the books in that series were huge edited volumes of many people, many scholars around India who wrote in it. And there were a few monographs, and this book was part of one of the monographs. And the aim of it was to at least open up the possibility of access to material for people to think about, and maybe open up the way they write about these things and think about it or teach them. But overall, I think the whole project as such, in spite of the fact that there are some excellent texts in many different aspects of philosophy and so on in it, did not make the kind of an impact that one would have expected. Of course, one way to characterize this is to say that there is from one hand, you have politeness at one level, and on the other hand, you have particularly from outsiders who encounter it and say, oh yeah, that's interesting, and let it go at that. And within the Indian context, I would say within a larger community of practitioners, there was a lack of confidence to think through these ideas critically, not just to say you accept what these people are saying, but to engage with them critically. And given the lack of a community, and given the suspicion towards anything which was not derived from the West, there was really no larger discussion on alternate formulations of philosophy of science. This, in spite of this project, in spite of very important work by the PP groups like PPST, alternate science forums, and so on. So there were, so in a sense, what I'm going to do for the remaining few minutes is actually to reflect on this, to talk about what I think is the state of the project of decolonizing philosophy of science in particular, but in the larger context of decolonizing itself. So in retrospect, I would say that the project of decolonizing philosophy of science was a doomed project right from the start, for various reasons, some of which I shall describe earlier. And one of the major problems I have found within this availability of decolonization within everyday practices in academic life in India is the problem has been the fact that decolonization itself has been appropriated so strongly in the sites of powerful institutions which were part of the colonial regimes of knowledge production. And in other words, it is almost like first you had a flow of knowledge within a particular colonial framework, and now we get a flow of knowledge of decolonization from very similar sites. Not all of them, but there are very many similar sites. And I think the examples of the movements in particularly in South Africa about decolonization in university education, etc., has been extremely inspiring. But I'm sure, and of course in parts of South America, but it's still going to be very difficult to reproduce in India. For a variety of the reasons, one of which is the fact that decolonization itself is beginning to be cited in these sites of powerful institutions. It's also difficult to speak of decolonization from our location. And today, I would say it's not just difficult, but increasingly dangerous, given the fact that we are caught between different types of political forces which are operate around us. But then the project of decolonization within India is also important because I'd argue that there are new types of colonizations that are replacing the earlier colonizers. I'm using these words colonization loosely, but just in the context of what I presume all of us know, since we are coming from this particular set of people here. So to me, if you ask me, would I do a book like this now? I don't think I would, because so this book was published in 2005, and if I want to relook at the question of decolonization of philosophy of science, I go back to a very simple point, and I'm going to summarize this particular view, which is the way I think the challenge of decolonization of philosophy of science has led me to the kinds of thoughts which I now have vis-a-vis the questions of decolonization of philosophy of science. So I think the first thing I have to start with in order to make sense of this term is to say, I have to first understand the function of philosophy of science. Since the only philosophy of science that exists in India today is the colonized discourse. And the related questions to this, when I ask the question, in other words, what I mean by function of philosophy of science, why philosophy of science in India? Why philosophy of science in Asia and Africa, for example? What am I expecting philosophy of science to do in these societies, right? What is that discipline expected to do? So when I ask that question, we have to perforce ask the questions, is there a global philosophy of science that is relevant for every society? Is there a universality of the philosophy of science discourse? And is that based on the so-called universality of science? Is philosophy itself universal across cultures? Or does a local philosophy of science imply the locality of science? And therefore, this might make us ask far more difficult questions. Are there local manifestations of science in a place like India? And the first thing when you talk about this, the first argument you'll hear is that, oh, Newton's laws are the same everywhere. And I would say to that, the argument that Newton's laws are the same everywhere is a red flag. Science is no longer about Newton's laws. And if we are holding on to these kind of ideas about science, then we are doing great disrespect to the very practice of science today, the very creative practice of science today. In the name of science, enormous amount of knowledge is being produced, and actually very little of it is like Newton's laws. So when I ask the question, what is the place of philosophy of science in India? I'm actually asking a larger question. What is the place of philosophy of science in Asia and Africa and South America and the global South in general? What is the place of the philosophy of science which you are seeing from the major textbooks produced in the West? So I would say, what is the purpose of philosophy of science? And to me, that's a far more useful way to start with. In the Indian context, I have been in this field for the last, when I came back and joined NIAS, it was in 1994, so it's over 25 years now. I've been struggling. We've been within science institutions, I've engaged extensively with scientists in science institutions and the social science communities. But even today, in spite of attempts by a few of us over the years, there are really no full-time professional courses on philosophy of science. It has been almost impossible to set up independent humanities institutes, including in Center for History and Philosophy of Science. There are one or two centers which are now coming up, but it's been for 25 years of struggle to make people listen to us. And I realize the point, now if you ask me, I realize it's actually the problem is a lot more complicated, and it reflects a lot on us, not really on the people who did not think philosophy of science mattered. So when I ask the question, for whom is philosophy of science meant for? Definitely not the scientists. We thought perhaps we'll get scientists interested in what we are saying. So maybe we'll have a dialogue with them. Maybe we'll work together with them. The scientists are not interested in it. They have consistently over decades held the position that disciplines, including disciplines like philosophy of science, and I think their view on sociology of science is much more harsher, but including questions like philosophy of science, are anti-science. They feel that it criticizes science, asks questions about science, and so on. I still remember a well-known scientist who was also very interested in philosophy, by the way, who once, when I was telling him about the work I was doing early in my career on the questions of Benacer's problem, which is the existence of mathematical entities, he listened to me telling him, oh, this is such an interesting question. What do mathematical entities exist? And then he turns to me and says, Sundar, why are you anti-mathematical? Why are you anti-mathematics? So the fact that that kind of a picture about these disciplines has pervaded so deeply into the scientific establishment that it is impossible, or not impossible. Now there have been some major shifts, very small shifts after years of fight. Science institutes, science and technology institutes in India, which are the highest valued institutes, which are the best funding and so on, like the IITs and ISERs, have for long resisted hiring people in philosophy of science, and of course in history and sociology of science. But I'm talking particularly about philosophy of science here. So scientists are not interested. We've just not been able to get through to them. Science policy people, they're very rarely, science policy, maybe a little bit of people from some social science discipline. I see now a lot more of science policy people coming just purely from science background. And so science policy, the philosophy of science is not contributing to it. In education, I've been engaged with science education people in India. We have had very good education groups in India, like in the Tata Institute of Social Sciences and so on. But philosophy of science is, really something which if somebody wants to come and teach, they may listen to it, but they don't see as something which they think is so necessary for their students who are working on education. Nobody is interested in it. The public is also least interested. And the government is not. I remember that one of the biggest funding groups in India called in science called DST, Department of Science and Technology. And once when I was having a discussion with the highest person there, the secretary of DST, he tells me, after I ask him about why they should fund centers in history and philosophy of science or science studies in order to improve science in India, he tells me, look, I have no philosophy of science, etc. I've done some courses. I think it's all a waste. If you want to do science of philosophy, I will support you. And this is something which is endemic. So the point, initially, I would blame these people for saying, oh, they are not able to see it. But I think now I'm really rechanged my view, and I'm asking why, what is this relevance of philosophy of science? What are we doing when we do philosophy of science? I've tried teaching philosophy of science for social science students, for humanities students, but the typical problem for this case is that these students feel they don't know the small details of science and the technical aspects of science, and they don't seem to have the confidence to take on the questions of science. And this is, in my view, the major problem why a very powerful social science community in India, which is otherwise very powerful, has remained very silent on various aspects of science and the functioning of science in the society. Now, for the last year and this year, I've been teaching this course very interestingly for science students at this very premier science institute, the Indian Institute of Science. And actually, I realized I'm not going to teach philosophy of science to them as a course, because again, the same question of why we are doing it, etc. comes. So what I teach a course now is called philosophical basis of scientific and mathematical concepts, by which I try and show them that we do science, but say that how scientific concepts are deeply driven by various philosophical and social cultural beliefs and catalysts which have driven science with various examples, and then show them the possibility that there are many different kinds of philosophical and historical and social cultural traditions which are available to the scientists to be able to think about these questions. So I think that's been a little more successful in my view. So the added problem to the question of philosophy of science in India is, in India, there is actually little more of sociology of science, definitely from very pioneering workers right from early times with Ashish Nandi, Shiv Vishwanathan and others. There was a whole tradition of that which came from that. There's also been a very good groups of history of science which has been working from the JNU group. We had Irfan Habib, Dhruv Raina and various others. We also have science policy and science education, etc. But philosophy of science is sadly lacking almost at every different levels of it. And if you look at social science disciplines, including disciplines like history and sociology, they don't think it's important to teach philosophy of science to their students. So, and I keep coming back to the question, so why and who for should we do philosophy of science? The philosophy departments in the country are not interested. There are no very good philosophy of science deep programs which are consistent for a strong, rigorous program anywhere in the country. And therefore, what happens to this small group of people who want to be part of this discipline? It becomes a completely borrowed discipline with no connection to practices of science in the country. And it just rehash undergraduate texts taught in the West. It speaks very little to the practice of science, not just in India, but science in the global South. So, very interestingly, the problems of this are also mirrored for philosophy in India. Some of the problems for philosophy of science. History and sociology in Indian universities are very strong disciplines. There are very well-known people. There's a long history of history and sociology in these disciplines, but not in the way we would see today with philosophy. We have had a very great tradition in philosophy with the Calcutta in Delhi and in Jaipur and so on. But there has been a major question about what do we understand by philosophy today. Very importantly, that philosophy itself has been distributed into different departments. There are people who quote unquote do philosophy in English department, sociology department, political science department, aesthetics department, of course not in science departments. And within philosophy departments, it is just broken up into different schools. And therefore, I would say that philosophy has been reduced to an ideology. And therefore, this raises the question of decolonization of philosophy of science, makes us ask very specific question about how do we then engage with this ways of the social character of philosophy and science. So I want to end with this question on what do we do with this question of philosophy of science here by asking who has a say in this discipline and where is the hegemony driven from. I want to give you an example of the latest STS handbook. Okay, very important. Everybody refers to it and everybody talks about it. I wrote a review for it for Current Science, and this is the review of the Handbook of Science and Technology Studies, the 4th edition, which was published in 2017. And I'm just reading this line, a couple of lines from this review, which is published in Current Science. I quote, interestingly for these editions, the editors decided to respond to a well-established problem within this field as in other academic disciplines. They consciously attempt to include, quote, in the words of the editors, they wanted to consciously include non-Western science and technology in this huge, humongous handbook. And the result of their conscious attempt to be open to this was that 5% of the authors came from institutes in Asia and 1/3 of this number from South America. If this is the outcome of a conscious attempt at inclusion, then it says much about the inherent prejudices and imbalance in the field itself. And I point out that while other disciplines can escape this criticism by hiding behind disciplinary protocols, for this to happen in a field like STS should be seen as a monumental failure. And that problem, has actually become much larger in the context of understanding decolonization in India. That it is just like I had said about philosophy of science, people ignoring the fact there's been a large amount of philosophical work done in different traditions within the dominant philosophy community and philosophy of some community, science community. And you can have, in spite of the fact that the largest number of scientists and technocrats are going to come are in India and China, for example, still the kind of theoretical work which comes from here is not represented at all in this so-called global handbooks of these disciplines. There is another specific problem to India. So not only is there a problem of neglect, in India, I would say there is a growing sense of a new colonization in these disciplines. And this colonization, very interestingly, in the context of India, is not connected to race. It comes paradoxically in the form of what we call as the NRIs, the non-resident Indians, Indian origin scholars, academic community in the West. I remember a time when there was a group of people who wanted to do some philosophy of science meeting, and one of my students sent an email to one of these persons, an NRI philosopher of science, I presume, in the US, saying that, that he has been working on this area and there have been people here who've been working on something in philosophy of science. And this person writes back to my student saying, he says, well, when the kind of philosophy of science we do is different, so what we want to come and show philosophy of science in India, a community in philosophy of science in India, is how to do proper and rigorous philosophy of science, with very little understanding of whatever a small group of people in India had been doing. So reflection of the experience of science in India and philosophy of science in India is also something which is reflective of what is happening with a different kind of a dynamics of this non-resident Indian academic community. Ironically, this is the case with Indian philosophy itself today. So to talk about Indian philosophy and philosophy of science in this context, today some of the most famous spokesperson for Indian philosophy are not from India. They are either NRIs or people from other cultures who are wonderful scholars, from people from whom we learn a lot from. But what has happened is that the majority of Indian philosophy scholars are outside India now, and that the majority of work which is done in the name of scholarship is being produced outside India. The handbook of, the Oxford Handbook of Indian Philosophy has excellent people, of course, writing about 40 pieces on it. And there is almost, except for a friend of mine who wrote on Ambedkar, there is, as far as I could see at a quick glance, there is not a single person who is working in India. In other words, the whole appropriation of notions of Indian philosophy with the name Indian in whatever it means has become something which is part of this particular global academic enterprise. And that makes it very difficult for us to work in these fields. And this has led to a very unique danger of doing decolonization work in India, something which may be very different in other countries. In fact, today it's extremely dangerous to talk about decolonization like I'm doing today, because of an attempt to dismiss every decolonial argument as a right-wing agenda. And I want to give you an example, and I've thought a lot about it, but I think it's important that I mention this example to tell you the kind of troubles and problems we might face even when we start invoking the possibility of other understandings, other epistemic systems, other knowledge systems from different particular cultures. And you can see this is something which is also related to this NRI question that I mentioned. I got ISIS, the most very well-known history of science journal published from Chicago, sent me a book for review in 2016 or so, and it was a book on Ayurveda. It was called Doctrine Traditions. It is written by a person called Projit Bihari Mukherjee, who is a faculty in the US in a university there. And it was a very good book. I enjoyed reading it. It is a very detailed historical analysis of very nitty-gritty details of Ayurvedic practice. In my review in ISIS, for a book sent by them to me, I wrote the following. I'm just reading 3 or 4 lines about it to tell you the impact of what happened. So I wrote, quote, although Doctrine Traditions, the name of that book, is rich in textual details and offers important historical insights, the argument is not sufficiently persuasive. Part of the reason is methodological and is perhaps largely about the problems of history of science as a discipline. Primarily, this has to do with a tendency to view non-Western systems as historical and social artifacts without any deep engagement, without their metaphysical and philosophical foundations. History of science of non-Western systems reflects particularly intensely the more general problem of the decoupling of history of science from philosophy of science. I wrote this in the context of a series of articles published in ISIS with Peter Gallison, I think, who had curated that, on the fact that history of science and philosophy of science have become far removed, and why it is important to engage with them. And I've just made the point that this is a very deeply good, interesting, rich historical text. But the fact is, without taking into certain questions of what we call as the knowledge systems of these particular Ayurveda, for example, it becomes the claims of the history of science is not sufficiently persuasive. That's all I wrote. Okay, and then a couple of years later, in another conference, somebody told me something about, they said, oh, there is a reference to your review, and it was a very derogatory comment on what I was said, and they said, oh, we know you're right wing or something like that. So I was very curious. I had not seen this thing, so I went back and looked at the piece. They sent me the paper written by this person, Project Bihari Mukherjee, who had written this book called Historicizing Indian Systems of Knowledge, published in a journal called Osiris, which is a sister publication of ISIS, in 2020. And I quote these exact words from it, okay? He begins this paper by saying this: history of science, it has recently been alleged, is incapable of studying the Ayurvedic medical tradition. Non-Western systems, the argument proposes, cannot be viewed as historical or social artifacts. They must instead be understood exclusively with reference to their metaphysical and philosophical foundations. He is quoting both as historical and social artifacts and metaphysical and philosophical foundations. The footnote is to my review of his book in a research paper, maybe of 8,000 words or something like that. And my review of his was 800 words, and a review which is what ISIS had wanted. So his point, he begins by saying this for what? So this is a response to his review without telling it's the response to a review, and selectively uses something which I had never said for what. And this is the crucial point. Such anti-historical claims that deny the historicity of non-Western peoples had once been the favored turf of European Orientalists, and they have been recently discovered by South Asians in themselves. And he says there are two major motors for this discovery, which is one, a strident Hindu nationalism, and two, which includes the fact that all of us who write about this are doing it because we want to get state money power, capturing state power in India, and we want to get money from the government to do this. And whereas he says have received vocal and lucrative state support, and then the other hand, a global market for Ayurvedic pharmaceuticals. When I saw this, I ignored it because, obviously he misunderstood, or he was upset about this, but the whole article goes on to attack a large number of Ayurvedic scholars in India by attacking them by what? Because they use the term Ayurvedic knowledge system by calling them right-wing. Okay, it's basically a rant which is published in an academic journal called Osiris. And I had wanted to ignore it, but what is very interesting is, again, what he points out, because he couldn't, I don't know why he writes this, but he wrote that, rather it is the fact that despite the seemingly obvious and intellectual political problems, such claims have now moved from the world of advertisers and politicians to the pages of respected academic journals. Indeed, the specific instance with which I commenced this discussion was in fact published in no less a venue than ISIS. And to me, this was academic dishonesty because the paper was not published in ISIS. It was a short 800-page review of his book which was published, and it is not about Ayurvedic knowledge systems. So I ignored it initially, and then I wrote to Osiris editors, and I wrote to ISIS. I pointed out that this is not a journal, it's not a research article, and you cannot attack Ayurvedic scholars and practitioners because they talk of alternate knowledge systems by linking them to right-wing and anti-caste and taking money from government. And I also pointed out, interestingly, the left, Kerala government's left, one of the best left governments we have had in the country, their official view is also on support to Ayurveda. They can see the articles by the Chief Minister Pinarayi Vijayan and the Minister Thomas Isaac. So all of this was present, but what is interesting, why I'm saying this is the response of the Osiris editors and Isis editors are very interesting. First, they responded to me by saying this is academic freedom, and then I tried explaining to them, and they said, Osiris editors. Then I said, I want to put a formal complaint about your journal for making these claims. They said, I have to complain to the ISIS because they come under ISIS. The ISIS editor said they would not do anything. He said, you write a letter, and the author will also write a letter responding to you. And they called this in the name of academic freedom. To me, I asked them, what is the freedom to misrepresent, look down upon people in other societies, and you destroy people's reputation and scholars in other countries with no evidential support? And therefore, this led me to ask the question of what is the ethics of decolonization? How do we formulate it? How is it that we do not become empirical subjects? The whole of Asia, the whole of the global South, how is it that we are not empirical subjects for the theoretical Western scholar? You know, my colleague and co-author Gopal Guru, a very important theorist in the country, he wrote a very important influential piece talking about empirical Shudras and theoretical Brahmins, which I adapt to saying empirical, Asians and theoretical Western scholars. And the point about that was that given this is the kind of way, particularly in the context of science, where the decolonization project here has to respond not just to technical aspects of supporting what we mean when we talk about philosophy or science, but it's actually become much worse because there is absolutely no way to hold these people responsible to what they do. And therefore, I go back to this very simple question that to decolonize philosophy of science is not really about philosophy at all. It's not really about science. And this is the last point I'll make. It is primarily to respond to this politics. And therefore, if you ask me how I understand it, and it's been my work over time now in the last few years, I understand the role of philosophy of science differently. I think that is my decolonial movement. I'm not interested in other philosophical classical traditions, etc. I would say that the first decolonized step in philosophy of science in the Indian context is to recognize that we produce philosophy of science for the public, not for the scientists, not for the social scientists, not for the students, not for the government, but for the public. Because both philosophy and science in India are caught up in a vicious hegemonical relationship with the public. The education and research system is exclusionary and keeps out an enormous number of deserving individuals on the basis of caste, class, gender, and religion. And we have had very similar problems in philosophy itself. And science has changed drastically, like I told you. It's no longer about traditional forms of science. 1 million papers are being put into archives. There are 8,000 papers that are being published every day. Scientists need curators to read their own papers in their discipline. It's only philosophy of science can make sense of this. And these are the questions of decolonization. And finally, and that's why the question, once you see philosophy of science as doing this political function of talking to the public, talking about philosophy and science to the public, then we really have a far more meaningful way of understanding philosophy of science and looking at decolonization of philosophy of science as a way to bring the global South to produce its philosophy of science, engaged with the questions of social justice in a very, very central way, and in drawing upon different critical traditions from the cultures of global South. Of course, the way to do this is to produce our own journals, create teaching material, courses which are inclusive, etc. But this has been the trajectory of the last 15 years of writing the book, Indian Philosophy and Philosophy of Science, to asking the question, why would I want to do and support philosophy of science today? I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your patience in listening to this.
Thank you so much, Sundar. That was amazing, fantastic. Thank you. I